Hi, this lecture is on the skeletal system, and in this unit we're going to look at not only the names of some of the 206 bones that are in the body, but we're also going to be looking at the structure of a long bone. To begin, let's look at the functions of the skeletal system. Mainly, the skeletal system is used in movement and support of the body. The skeletal system provides points of attachments for your muscles, and of course your muscles are involved in body movement. It also provides support. The backbone is the main support center for the upper body, and it holds your head up, it protects your spinal cord, and it serves as a point of attachment for your arms. So we have support and movement for the main functions of. Also, in addition to support and movement, we have protection and the making of blood. So an example of how the skeletal system protects your organs would be your skull protecting your brain, your ribs protecting your lungs and your heart. So they shelter them and protect those vital organs. The bone also functions to make blood. If we look at the inside of a long bone, we will find that it is filled with bone marrow. And red and white blood cells are formed in this bone marrow in the center of the bone. And this is, on the inside of a long bone where we find red and white blood cells being formed. So it makes blood. Skeletal system. Oops. The skeletal system is also involved in the storage of ions and minerals such as calcium and phosphorus, which the body would then need. There are two major divisions of the skeletal system. We have the axial skeleton, which is made up of the skull, the cranium, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage, which we would know better as our ribs. And then we have the appendicular skeleton. Appendicular refers to appendages, which are your arms and legs. So we have arms, legs, and the pelvic girdle, or the pelvis, are parts of the appendicular skeleton. Bones have basic shapes. They will fall in one of the following categories. Long bones, such as the bones in your arms and your legs and in your fingers. You have short bones, like the ones that are found in your wrists. We call them carpals. And also your kneecap, which is known as your patella. We have irregularly shaped bones, such as your spine and your pelvis. They don't fall into either of the other categories. And then we have flat bones, like your skull is made up of flat bones. Your scapula, as shown in the picture here, which is your shoulder blade. And also your sternum or your breastbone. Those are all flat bones. For the structure of bone, a layer called the periosteum covers the entire long bone. And the bone is made of two types of bone tissue. Now remember, a bone is considered an organ and is made of bone tissue, which we have talked about before. The two types of bone tissue are compact bone, which we looked at when we talked about tissues, and spongy bone. So compact bone lies underneath the periosteum, whereas spongy bone is underneath the compact bone. So you can see these in the picture here. We have compact bone all around in here, and then we have spongy bone found here where we have lots of these spaces in there. Bone marrow fills the gaps in between the spongy bone. So the spongy bone is filled with bone marrow, particularly red marrow. And then on the inside of the bone, you have a cavity. So it's a hollow space that is filled with yellow marrow. And this is called the medullary cavity. Get my highlighter back here. Okay. The ends of a long bone are called the epiphyses, singular is epiphysis, whereas the center of the long bone is called the diaphysis. Bones are complex living structures that undergo growth and development. A thin, tough outer membrane covers the bone, the periosteum, And beneath the membrane is a layer of the compact bone. Compact bone can be described as hard and dense. Although it is not solid, it doesn't have as many holes and spaces as spongy bone does. Spongy bone has many small spaces. It helps to reduce the weight of the skeletal system, but it is still really, really strong. It is also found at the ends of the bones, as we saw in the previous diagram. In the spaces of bones, there's a soft connective tissue called marrow, and I mentioned this comes in two types, red and yellow. Red is going to be used to produce the body's blood cells, whereas yellow is going to store fat that can later be used as an energy reserve. Also notice that the bone is has all of these blood vessels that flow through it. Okay, so there is a really good blood supply to all of this bone tissue. The structure of bone makes it both strong and lightweight. 20% of an adult's body weight is made up of bone. And we said before, the two main minerals associated with bones are calcium and phosphorus. You can see here the percentage of the total amount of the body and also the composition of the bone here. As an infant, you didn't have a lot of bones. Mostly you were made of cartilage. Cartilage is a connective tissue. It's flexible, and then over time, most of the cartilage is replaced by solid bone. Ones that are not replaced would be in your nose and in your ears and in the ends of the long bones for cushioning. Then we're going to start with identifying some of the bones of the body, and we're going to begin with the clavicle. The clavicle is better known as your collarbone. So you can see the clavicle here. Pay attention to the shape of the bones as we go through, because you may be asked to identify these as they are attached. We call them articulated, put together in the skeleton. And you may be asked to identify them when they are disarticulated, when just a clavicle is shown in the picture or sitting on the lab table. The clavicle or collarbone holds the shoulder joint away from the rest of the upper body, and it's about as thick as your little finger. The scapula, or what we would call the shoulder blade, is located on the back side of the rib cage and helps provide a part of the shoulder joint and helps with the movement of the arms. So these are the scapula. Scapulae would be plural. The vertebral column is divided into three sections. The cervical region, you can see here in letter A in green, is the part that makes up your neck. The thoracic region, you can see in the blue in letter B. And then this is what the ribs attach to. And then the last main section of the vertebral column is C, the lumbar region, which would be like your lower back. If you've ever heard of someone having lumbar support, like if you need lumbar support, that means you need support on your lower back section. Now, the end of the vertebral column, it ends in D and E here. You see on the diagram, D is called the I just lost my train of thought. D is called the sacrum, and E is called the coccyx. Now the sacrum, D, is actually made of 5 fused bones put together, and then E, the coccyx, is known better as the tailbone. So you can see that here. The sacrum is this section. It's made up of 5 fused bones, and then the coccyx, or the tailbone, is at the posterior end. The humerus is the next bone we're going to look at, and this is the upper arm bone. And you can identify it because it looks like it has like a scroll portion here. I'm going to remove that so you can see it better. It's like a scroll on one side. This is the part where it would meet with the radius and the ulna. The humerus. The radius and ulna are the bottom lower parts of your arm. The radius is on the top and the ulna is on the bottom. And one way you can remember that is that the radius is on the side of the hand where your thumb is located. So we remember that the radius is rad. Give it a thumbs up so it'll help you remember that the radius is on the thumb side of the body. The ulna would be on the opposite side. Next are the carpals. The carpals are the wrist bones. These are very small bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Can't really see. Yeah. So we have the trapezium, the trapezoid, and then the capitate and hamate if we're going across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we come back the other direction, we have the pisiform, the triquetrum, we have lunate, and we have scaphoid. And it would be beneficial to you to learn those in order. The metacarpals are numbered 1 to 5. So you have the first beginning with the thumb, then the second, third, fourth, and fifth. All of those are metacarpals. So we have the carpals here in the wrist, and then we have the metacarpals next. And then finally, we would have the phalanges. Phalanges are the bones of your fingers. They're shown here in these colors. And then you have proximal, intermediate, and distal phalanges that make up your fingers. And of course, proximal are the ones closer to your body, whereas distal are the ones toward the tips of the fingers. Rib cage is next. Ribs can be classified as one of 3 types. True ribs, which are pairs 1 through 7, attached directly to the sternum. You can see that here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The false ribs are 8, 9, and 10. You can see they do not attach directly to the sternum. They actually attach to that 7th pair of true ribs. So that's why we call those false. And then finally you have the floating ribs, which do not attach at all to the front. They're attached to the back. You can see them here and here. Kind of have to look behind the thoracic cage. Those are floating ribs. The sternum, which we know better as the breastbone, is made up of 3 parts. The most superior part is called the manubrium. The center part is called the body. And then the bottom part ends in kind of a point is called the xiphoid process. The pelvis is made up of several parts. The top of the pelvic bone here is called the ilium. You can see that on both sides. The bottom sections are called the ischium. And those are in alphabetical order. L comes before S. So ilium's on top, ischium's on the bottom. You have the pubic bone on both sides. Here and here, those sections. And then in the center, it's not labeled on this diagram, but there's a tiny piece of cartilage here, and that is called the pubic symphysis. It kind of connects the 2 halves together. The femur is another long bone. This is the bone that is in your thigh, and it is the largest bone in the body. You can see here it has a head. We call this the head of the femur. Of the femur. And then there are 2 processes. We have the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. Those little processes found on the sides of the femur. The tibia and fibula, these are the lower parts of the leg. The tibia you may know better as your shin. And then that's the larger of the 2, and then the fibula is the smaller of the 2. And I remember this because the fibula, you tell a little fib, right? It's just a little fib, so it's the little bone of the 2. So fibula is smaller, tibia is larger. Tarsals, these are comparative to the carpals in the hand, but they are found in the foot. You do not have to learn the names of these. I did ask you to learn the names of the carpals, but not the tarsals. And then just like in the hand, we have the metatarsals, numbered 1 to 5. And the phalanges, also numbered 1 to 5. So you can see how the tibia and the fibula articulate here with the tarsals. The next section that we need to look at are joints. Joints are places where two bones come together, and there are several classifications of joints. Two main types are immovable and movable. Immovable joints are those found in the skull. An immovable joint allows for little or no movement. And if we look at the cranial bones here, we're going to name these as well. The frontal bone, of course, is in the front, so that kind of makes sense. The parietal bone, there are two of these, one on each side. The temporal bone, there are two of those, one on each side. And if you think about where your temples are, that's kind of where your temporal bone is. There is one occipital bone, which is found on the back of the head, and this corresponds to the occipital lobe of the brain, which controls your eyesight. And then you have the sphenoid and the ethmoid, most of those two bones are found on the inside of the cranial cavity. Movable joints, most of the joints in your body are movable, and there are several different types. You can see 3 on the diagram here. One is ball and socket, and this is found where your arm, the humerus, articulates with the clavicle and scapula. It allows a wide range of motion. Hinge joints, like the one found in your knee area, allows you to move like frontwards and backwards. And you have pivot joints and also gliding joints. We'll talk about those. For the ball and socket, your example again is your shoulder and your hip, and it allows the greatest range of motion. We call it ball and socket because the ball, or the head of the femur, for example, is the ball, and then the socket is this indentation of the pelvis called the acetabulum. For a hinge joint, examples again are knee and elbow, and allows backward and forward motions, just like a hinge on a door. The pivot joint, in your neck, for example, your wrist and your ankles, allows one bone to rotate around another. Now, we talked about the cervical vertebrae being the top section of the vertebrae in your neck. The first 2 vertebrae actually have their own names. So the one on the top, vertebrae number 1, is called the atlas, and then vertebrae number 2 is called the axis. And your cranium, your skull, actually sits on a protrusion of the axis. It kind of protrudes up into here, and that's what it rests upon, and that's a pivot joint. Gliding joints allow bones to slide over one another. This is like your knuckles and your wrist and your ankle. And then finally, ligaments and tendons. Ligaments connect bone to bone, whereas tendons attach muscles to bones. So bone to bone, ligament, muscle to bone is a tendon.